long. They were working with the Colorado Parks and the Wildlife Commission. It wasn't Parks and Wildlife at the time. Eventually with Parks and Wildlife, and the agency, working the political angles with the governor's office. They couldn't get any action on it, and that's why they went to a ballot initiative. They felt that it wasn't going to happen through agency decisions, so the only way to make it happen, knowing that how much support was out there for wolf restoration among the public, they felt the ballot initiative was the way to go to force the agency to actually take action and bring wolves back to Colorado. So as you know, it was passed by voters on November 3rd, passed by a very slim margin, which is continuing to be a point that is brought up by the anti-wolf folks. And it requires CPW and the commission to develop a plan and begin restoration of wolves to Colorado by the end of 2023. So the bare minimum that has to happen is a plan has to be in place, and at least one pair of wolves has to be released by December 31st of 2023. It does require a compensation program for livestock losses to wolves. So that's something that was known needed to be a component of the initiative, or it wouldn't have gone anywhere. So why should we restore wolves? Well, there are ecological reasons, all the interactions that wolves have, and this is a very simplified diagram of the interactions a wolf has in its natural environment. Then there are the ethical reason, and can't be quoting Immanuel Kant. He said, do the right thing because it's the right thing. So the ecological reasons are complex. The interactions that are in any ecosystem are very complex. They're not always definitive. You can't always say, well, we introduced wolves and this is what happened. If somebody gives you that line, there's always more to the story. It's always more complicated than that. But wolves evolved with their prey for nearly 300,000 years across their range, and for at least 10,000 in Colorado since the last glaciation. So they were an integral part of the ecosystems, and large predators are particularly important in the way ecosystems function. As far as the ecological reasons, we know some of the functions of wolves, but we really don't know them all. We never know everything about ecology and how it works. We do know that wolves improve the health of their prey populations. That's one of those old saws. Sometimes you hear these kind of rules of thumb that you kind of wonder about the reality of. But when it comes to wolves, they do take the young, the sick, the ones that are easy to kill. They can kill perfectly healthy animals. That's not to say they can't, and they sometimes do. But there's no question that they focus on the easiest ones to kill. It only makes sense if you're a wolf. They do promote positive changes in landscape condition. These two photos are from Yellowstone National Park, pre-introduction and post. Now, a lot of people say that this was entirely due to wolves changing the behavior of elk, in particular in the way elk use the riparian areas. It's a little more complicated than that, and not all scientists agree that that's exactly what happened. And actually, I don't think any of them agree that's the only thing that happened. Beavers were coming back, some were reintroduced, and beavers started to re-inhabit Yellowstone, and that was also part of this change. But wolves did have an effect, and just logically, wolves do have a positive effect on their ecosystems. Some people use the word balance, and it's a difficult word for most scientists to use because it's really kind of poorly defined. And I tend not to use it, and I just tend to go to the concept that wolves were here. They were part of our original fauna. They were an important part of our original fauna as a large predator, so they just belong. And that's really where I end up on kind of the ethical end of things. And as I said, we don't know everything about the ecological functions, and ignorance about things suggests that we should be cautious. And so the fact that we removed wolves without really thinking about what their overall role was in the ecosystem, the concern was what they were doing to livestock and not about their function in the ecosystem. We didn't really think about it. And we know that we can't duplicate the effects of wolves in ecosystems. Some people will say, well, if you want to manage elk populations, we hunt elk, and we can just use that technique as a way to manage elk populations and get the same effects. Doesn't work that way because wolves are out on the landscape 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 a year, and hunters are not. And also there is ample evidence to demonstrate that wolves take different kind of prey, or different age and sex class of prey, than hunters do. Hunters often are after a trophy animal, a large bull elk, for example, whereas we know that even in terms of age, wolves take older cow elk by about 7 years age differential as far as the average age of an elk that a wolf kills, as opposed to the average age of an elk cow that a hunter kills. So there are a lot of things that are going on there with wolf predation that are different and things that we can't duplicate in the same way. One of the other ecological reasons is the need for genetic interchange. You saw this map earlier with the Mexican gray wolf population down here, the northern Rockies wolves coming down into central Wyoming. And I think you're all aware that Wyoming has a law that has classified the wolf as a predator, which in Wyoming means that you can pretty much kill it any way you want, anytime you want, with anything you want. So wolves getting across southern Wyoming are real survivors, because they are going across a very, very difficult gauntlet to get to Colorado. But some have. We know some have, and we know we have the first pups in Colorado now from a pair of wolves that did disperse from Wyoming. But what Colorado is adding is, if we have this connection in Colorado, a population of wolves, we will then have a linkage all the way from Greenland, all the way down to southern New Mexico and Arizona, and potentially later down into central Mexico as wolves reestablish there. And that's a really important connection. It's one that will allow wolves to disperse both north and south from Colorado, and which would improve the genetic performance of populations both to the north and the south. It's an important connection that we would be reestablishing. This is Aldo Leopold, the father of wildlife management, and y'all probably have heard this quote more than once: to keep every cog in wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering. And Leopold was actually talking about wolves when he made that statement in, I don't believe it was in Sand County Almanac, but wherever he made it, he was speaking about wolves at the time, and just pointing out that when we remove something from an ecosystem, we really don't know what happens. And he observed what happened when wolves were removed from the Southwest, in particular in Arizona and New Mexico. And this is what he was talking about, that we made changes that we didn't really realize what kind of effects they were going to have. The ethical reasons, for me, there really is only one. I mean, it's our responsibility to manage, protect, and restore natural resources, but it's the right thing to do. And I don't blame the people that removed wolves back in, into the early 20th century. They thought they were doing the right thing. They did. They were trying to protect their investments and their way of life. But in hindsight, we can see that both ecologically and ethically, it was the wrong thing to do. And we now are moving towards fixing that error that we made. I do want to address just biology in general, and I kind of touched on this a little bit. And I use this terminology over and over again, that ecological processes are complex, and they are. We don't know everything about them, but people don't like complexity. They like to hear wolves were reintroduced and riparian areas recovered, therefore it was wolves. And that's simply not true. And I'll get to an example that goes the opposite direction in a little bit. But populations of wolves and the populations of their prey are affected by a lot of different things. And those include habitat condition, weather, disease, predation on the prey animals. And usually no one factor can completely explain the changes. And in fact, I don't think it ever can explain the changes that you see in a population of animals. So when you hear those things that, for example, that wolves were reintroduced in Idaho, and the prey population, the elk population, crashed, there's two problems with that. One is that it's not true, and I'll show you some data on that in a little bit. But also, no one factor, as I say, can explain it. It wasn't just wolves that caused changes to elk populations. So now I'm going to go into some of the concerns and some of the sort of myth busting that I do with wolf issues. So the concerns are there's not enough habitat available in Colorado for wolves, that they're going to negatively impact big game populations, that there will be extensive livestock depredation, that there's a concern for human safety, a disease concern, which I'll go into more detail on, and wolf taxonomy. And that is the question of, well, what kind of wolves were in Colorado and what kind of wolves should be here in terms of the subspecies. And lastly, the cost of the reintroduction efforts. People have criticized the amount of money it will take to restore wolves. So habitat availability, frankly, is not an issue. Wolves are habitat generalists, meaning they can live anywhere that there's enough prey and people let them live there, that there is some tolerance for wolves. They can live just about anywhere. There are multiple studies that have looked at the number of wolves that could be in Colorado, and this is just a carrying capacity, not a target for any reason other than saying this is how many wolves could survive in Colorado. And it's been between 500 and about 1,000 wolves are what the capacity is expected to be. Prey is the most important habitat component anywhere for wolves, and Colorado has plenty of prey. We have the largest elk herd anywhere of any state in the Western North America. So we have plenty of elk, and we also have plenty of deer. There's enough prey for wolves in Colorado. And the concern about human density and wolf density is one that I kind of put together this little table of just demonstrating that there are places in the world where there are much higher densities of humans and higher densities of wolves. And if Colorado had 500, whoops, that was my mistake. If Colorado had 500 wolves, that would be about 1.1 wolves per 100 square miles. And about 37, we have about 37 people on the western slope in Colorado per square mile. So those are a little different 100 square miles versus square miles, just because this figure would have been really a tiny fraction that nobody would have understood very readily. But just relatively looking at the other places, if you look at the wolf counties where wolves are in Montana, lower population density for sure, but higher wolf density. And then you start to look at some of the other places in the world, like Israel, Russia, Poland, where there are much higher densities of humans and similar densities of wolves, or even higher densities of wolves. And even if we had 1,000 wolves in Colorado, there are places like some of the Eastern European countries which have much higher human densities and higher wolf densities. So there's no question wolves and people can live together. Sure, they have the same kind of issues we're going to have in Colorado with wolves, but they can live together if people will tolerate the wolves. One of the other concerns is impact of prey populations. Now, they think that some people will say they're going to greatly reduce prey populations. His favorite word is decimate. But wolves evolved with their prey for nearly 300,000 years and at least 10,000 in Colorado. It makes absolutely no sense that a predator is going to eliminate its prey. And wolves, we know, regulate their own numbers very well. They've established territories. They won't allow other wolves to establish or to occupy those territories. And so they regulate their own population size, which is geared towards the amount of prey that they have. So the prey does, at some level, help control the number of wolves, and the wolves control their own numbers. And as far as the numbers of elk in Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, 1995 was the, why do I keep doing that? 1995 was the date of reintroduction in Yellowstone and central Idaho. Idaho had 112,000 elk then, they now have 117,000 roughly. Montana had 109,000, they now have 138,000. Wyoming had 103,000, and they have slightly more up, not a lot more. But the point is, these elk numbers all increased and substantially in Montana with wolves and with as many as 2,000 wolves across those three states. And this is what the sales of elk licenses, and not surprisingly, Montana's elk license sales went up substantially, about 30%, similar to the increase in the elk population. And Wyoming's and Idaho's are fairly level with what they were, again, in concert with the relatively small increases they had in their elk population. But the point is, this didn't affect recreational use, recreational hunting of elk, and it didn't affect the numbers of elk. And if you want to play a silly game, you can say it looks like in Montana, wolves cause the elk population to increase. I know that's not true. You know that's not true, but it's the kind of game that people like to play with numbers. So another area I like to talk about is the way wolves operate as predators and the concept of surplus killing. First of all, wolves are a coursing predator, which means they test their prey. They typically find animals that they can start to find in an open area. They can make them run, and when they run, they pick out the ones that are easiest to kill. They'll find the animal that has, a limp and is therefore not as fast as the other ones, or because it has some disease, it's slower and easier to kill. That's their hunting style. They test their prey and they take the easiest ones. The main prey is ungulates, which is hoofed animals, and their favorite prey is, at least in the western United States, is by far elk. 80% of the prey eaten by wolves in Yellowstone, for example, is elk. And it's dangerous for wolves to attack animals up to 20 times their size. This is a mother moose just kicking the crap out of a wolf that was going after her calf. And every prey animal that wolves regularly pursue, every ungulate prey animal has killed a wolf. We know that historically. And wolves in some places, almost every wolf ends up injured just from hunting incidents because they're dealing with these very large animals with sharp hooves. And their success rate is only 20%. So 1 out of every 5 hunts that they begin, they are actually successful at killing their prey. And so they're not out there killing just for fun because it's dangerous for them to do it. And they're really not that good at it. I mean, in a certain sense, a 20% success. That doesn't mean that surplus killing doesn't occur. Occasionally it does. under very rare circumstances, like when the animals are in deep snow, a concentration of animals. That has happened. It's happened on one time that we're aware of on a feedlot in Wyoming, where there's a concentration of animals, deep snow, the wolves got in there. And you know, you've probably seen your dog or your cat kind of go a little bit nuts when there's a number of prey animals around, and that can happen. But it is very, very rare. You may know Dave Meach. He is probably the premier wolf biologist in the world. And Dave has seen surplus killing occur 3 times in his career over 50 years. The disease I mentioned is called Hydatid disease. All canids, which are coyotes, foxes, dogs, and wolves, carry this disease. It's a tapeworm, and dogs or canids are the primary host for this particular tapeworm. It's now known to be in Colorado. There was some question about whether it was or not, but they have actually found it in some of the collected feces from the wolves that are in Colorado, which is not unexpected. If they look for it in coyotes and feral dogs and foxes, they would find it there too, almost certainly. But it wouldn't be coming in with wolves that were reintroduced, because those wolves would all be treated to prevent it. But if it's there in the environment, they're going to pick it up again. And this is the disease cycle of Hydatid disease. Again, the canid is the primary host for it. The adults develop in the canid. The eggs are deposited in the feces of the canid, and then they're picked up by an ungulate of some kind, and then go back through that cycle. They develop into larvae in the ungulate. When the canid eats the ungulate, especially the internal organs, that's when it goes back and then forms adults again in the canid. Humans are an offshoot of this. They're an accidental host. And the way that happens most commonly, and the most common infections that we know about, are among people who have sheepdogs and who work closely with their dogs and often sleep with their dogs. And so they are accidentally picking up the feces or the eggs in the feces of their dogs, or they're on their dogs. So that's how it happens. And it can be a nasty disease, but it's very, very, very rare. And there has never been a biologist infected in the United States with Hydatid disease, in spite of the fact that they're constantly handling wolf scat. It just doesn't happen very often. It's a red herring is what it is. Another myth is the concern about wolf taxonomy. And people will talk about the Canadian wolf, and that it has little fear of humans. It is always doing surplus killing. That's kind of just does it for fun. They're bigger than any of the other wolves, and they have a larger litter size. And that's really all bunk. Wolves are wolves across their entire range, even from Western Europe all the way across Asia and throughout the North American continent. And wolf taxonomy is complicated, but taxonomy is complicated. Wolves across the world, as I've said, are the same species, Canis lupus. There are some behavioral and size differences, and those are most often due to environmental factors, not genetics, that they are a different animal. They're not a different animal, they're the same thing. And that's especially true of interactions with humans. Those are learned behaviors that the wolves learn just by the way that people treat them. So the differences that are claimed to be from this supposed Canadian wolf just really don't exist as a genetically based issue. As I said, subspecies are complicated. The original classification that divided into subspecies had 24 different subspecies of wolf in North America. Now they're considered to be 4 or 5, depending on how you look at it. This is the Occidentalis, which is in the Northwest. Nubilis was across the central part of the continent. This is the Mexican gray wolf, Bailey. And this is one that there's still some controversy over whether it's a subspecies as shown here, Canis lupus lacayon, or whether it is Canis lacayon, a separate species. And there's been some evidence presented on both those. But at any rate, the point is that there are very few subspecies now recognized. And that's because taxonomy changes, and it's not something that's very permanent. And these black lines on this map, they're clearly gradations. They're not. It isn't if you step over the line, you turn into something else. It's they're more an area of intergradation. And again, all these wolves, all the populations of wolves interchanged with each other across the entire range. And again, this is Canis rufus, the red wolf, which is a different species in the southeastern part of the U.S. Another concern that's been expressed or criticism is the cost, and it's anticipated to be about $500,000 a year, maybe even up to $1 million a year. And there's going to be continued monitoring and management, so CPW is going to have long-term costs associated with a population of wolves in the state. But CPW has lots of money available, honestly, to fund wolf restoration. The legislature just awarded $1.1 million in the long bill, the budget bill. So the CPW has that money available starting in a few weeks on July 1st to help support the wolf reintroduction program. They also have dollars from the Great Outdoors Colorado, the lottery funds. They have federal funds from the State Wildlife Action Plan grants that they get every year. And there could be some changes in where they spend money in terms of priorities. And my point of this is one of our district wildlife managers, what most people think of as game wardens. They get new trucks regularly. They're still going to get new trucks. This is not going to affect anything that happens with what game wardens can and can't do. But there may be some changes in where they spend the money. And this is a Colorado River cutthroat. And some of the funds that I mentioned are being spent on them right now. And it's possible that some of those funds will be reprogrammed to help support wolf restoration. But there's no question that CPW has plenty of money to work on wolf restoration. Bottom line about wolves is that coexisting with them can be challenging, but it's really not all that hard. When you look across the world, people can get along with high densities of wolves. And there will be some undesirable social and biological effects, but there also will be multiple positive effects, including restored ecosystems and the removal of diseased prey. And from the ethics end, it's the right thing to do. So that's kind of my part on the biology and the mythology of wolves. Oh, this is a great source of information for you. If you just Google the Center for, oh, hang on, the Center for Human and Carnivore Coexistence at CSU. They have a great series of frequently asked questions and information sheets, strong scientific basis for everything that's there. CSU did a really nice job of this. So if you want some more solid background, that's a great place to start. I tend not to tout my own stuff, but there is I have a number of posts on the San Juan Citizens Alliance blog, which are a very condensed version of some of this kind of information. So there are places you can find information. In fact, there's too much information out there when you start to look for wolf information, but I would highly recommend this as a source to get some really good background information. Now what I want to talk about is the CPW planning process and where they are and how they're going to put together a wolf management plan for the state. So the agency has hired the Keystone Policy Center as their facilitator and consultant for the plan development. And Keystone has a really stellar reputation for working on complex environmental issues and contentious environmental issues like water management, for example. And so they were an excellent choice, in my opinion, to take on this job. So far, they've created two groups that will work on the plan. One is a technical working group, which has been called the TWIG, just because it seemed like that was a natural thing to call it. And this is agency representatives and scientists from across the West who are involved in the technical working group or members of that group. They did have their first meeting just this past Tuesday, and that was largely an organizational event, so there's not much to come out of it yet, but other than getting them up and running. The Stakeholder Advisory Group, or SAG, represents a range of views across the social spectrum about wolves, and I was just selected as a member of that group. Our first meeting will be next Friday, the 25th. So I will be a part of this group and be providing my perspective on wolf management for Colorado. And both of these groups are advisory. They're not decision-making bodies, but they do advise CPW on what they think should be involved and what sorts of constraints there should be in a wolf management plan. So how are they going to do this? It's going to be meeting after meeting after meeting. Keystone is scheduling more than 40 public meetings over the next 3 months, and there will be the opportunity for online comment as well. There are going to be 13 regional open houses. 7 will be on the Western Slope. Western Slope politicians in particular have kept the pressure up to have a lot of interaction on the Western Slope because that's where the wolves will be, and that's perfectly reasonable. There will be 17 West Slope focus groups. So these are going to be groups that Keystone and CPW select to have detailed discussions about wolves. There are going to be 2 tribal consultation meetings, 10 virtual interest-based focus groups. So those are going to be things like hunters or wolf advocates or ranchers, that they will have those focus groups throughout this process. There'll be one day-long statewide virtual town hall, and there'll always be the opportunity for online comments. So the process is, if nothing else, it's cumbersome. There's a lot going on. There'll be a lot of meetings. Anybody that feels they don't have an opportunity to provide their input on the wolf management plan is not trying very hard, in my opinion. So next, I wanted to talk about the incident that recently occurred in the Northwest, or at least we learned about, in Northwest Colorado with the regional manager. There are allegations and accusations that came out of this. And one of the things I think it's important to understand is CPW's structure so that you understand kind of how this individual fits into the agency. CPW, the state, is divided up into 4 regions for CPW. And those, there's a Northwest, Northeast, Southwest, Southeast, pretty straightforward. These dark black lines are the divisions between the regions. This individual is the regional manager in the Northwest Colorado, the Northwest region of CPW. So they, manage this area from near Grand Junction north, includes North Park, Jackson County. So that's the area that they have administration over. The regional structure are at the field level are the district wildlife managers or game wardens. They each have a district, a relatively small geographic area. They are then comprise areas. So each area has anywhere from about 8 to 15 district wildlife managers. And there's an area wildlife manager, and the area wildlife managers are supervised by the regional manager, the individual that's been charged with these particular missteps, we'll call them, I guess. So just want to understand that that's that structure, but there is another part to the agency, which is the biological arm of the agency. And this has really been an unfortunate incident from my viewpoint. And I was a biologist with the agency, so I have my biases, but this was the regional side of the agency, not the biological side. And the biological side is the one that's tasked with developing this wolf management plan. And they are the ones that are going to move it forward. They are not implicated in any way in any of the misdeeds that purportedly occurred with the regional manager in the Northwest region. So just to go over these quickly, the individual I'm talking about is the Northwest Regional Manager, J.T. Romatsky. He has been, was accused by a fellow employee, by someone that he supervised, of using state resources to develop anti-wolf videos and social media content, coaching the Association of Northwest Colorado Governments, which is a county-based organization, which is pretty conservative, just considering it's based in Northwest Colorado, with the county governments being the primary members of the group, coaching them on how to develop anti-wolf approaches. He actively, and again, these are allegations, I don't know if any of these are true, he actively campaigned against the confirmation of 2 Colorado Parks and Wildlife commissioners. The commissioners were nominated by the governor, but weren't confirmed until just recently. And so during that period when they weren't yet confirmed, he was campaigning against them. So a whistleblower, Randy Hampton, who was the public information officer in the Northwest region, filed a complaint with the Department of Natural Resources, which is the department that oversees the division of parks and wildlife. So it's a little higher organizational structure. And that's the way complaints work in the state process. They go to the department level. Romatsky was placed on 12 weeks of paid leave while the investigation went on. Some of the allegations were confirmed. This is what the state has told us, but nobody knows. Well, we don't know what those are. We don't know the public doesn't know which allegations were confirmed through the investigation. Romatsky was reinstated into his position in April, so he's back as the regional manager in Northwest Colorado. Randy Hampton was given the option of working under Romatsky, going back to work for him, and having to work in the office with him, or resigning was something he didn't think he could do, so he resigned. And Randy and JT were friends. It's a really sad situation overall, the way it happened and the fact that it happened. And it's given the agency a deserved black eye that this happened. And it does bring up serious questions about the culture of the agency and the fact that this could have happened. Hampton is happy in Hawaii. He moved back to Hawaii. He was there before, and he's establishing his own business. So Randy came out okay in this, but the whole situation, frankly, is just very disturbing, and it just stinks. My view of it is that Romatsky clearly did some of the unethical things he was charged with, as DNR has told us. The state personnel rules are complex and very protective of employees, so it's likely we will never know exactly what he did do and what he didn't do, or what they confirmed that he did. And some discipline, though, undoubtedly took place. And again, it's something that, because of the complexity and the way the rules are set up, we'll never know what that discipline was. unless JT wants to tell us for some reason. So now I'm done with the wolf end of things. I'm going to move on to a little bit on bighorn sheep and finish up with bighorns. Bighorn sheep were probably the most common ungulate in Colorado when Europeans arrived. They were in a lot of places that we don't even think of as sheep habitat. And we have this tendency to think of bighorns as being a species that lives in the high mountains up in the tundra, and they do, and they are there for various reasons. Just the history of how bighorns were extirpated from large parts of their range in Colorado. But I look at, for example, the cliffy lands south of Durango along the Animas all the way down towards Cedar Hill. There were undoubtedly bighorns in all of that area. And the other thing is that when you see a set of prehistoric petroglyphs or pictographs, there are almost always bighorns in them somewhere. You don't see elk, you don't see deer, but you do see bighorns. Now, there could be a cultural thing, but there's no question that they're much more common in the depictions in petroglyphs and pictographs than are the other species. So in Colorado, in 1900, it was estimated we had about 7,300 bighorn sheep left. And yet there were probably tens or even approaching 100,000 before that. In 1970, there were about 2,200. So they actually declined throughout most of the 20th century. DOW and CPW began an intensive trapping, transplant, and disease management and habitat manipulation program that went on for, since then, since 1970, very aggressive. And right now we have about 7,000 bighorn sheep. So we were able to return to the level that there was in 1900, but actually slightly less probably than we had at that point. So why is it that we can't have more sheep? Well, the big issue is disease from domestic sheep. Mycoplasma ovipneumoniae is a bacterium that is harbored by domestic sheep and goats and some other domestic ungulates. And it causes, in those domestics, it can cause some serious disease, but for the most part is not all that threatening to the populations of domestic animals. In bighorns, it's a different story. As I said, it's carried by sheep and goats. What it causes in bighorns is a number of symptoms: coughing, nasal discharge, fever, lethargy, and eventually death. Not all of them die, but it's common when an outbreak of this disease occurs in bighorns that up to 90% of the herd will be killed by this particular bacterium. It's a nasty disease for bighorns, and it's transmitted from the domestic animals. The effects of it are, of course, some just flat out die from the disease, but the most insidious effect of it is that it causes long-term reduced lamb survival. So the lambs just aren't very thrifty when they're born. They end up not surviving through the winter, and then therefore don't add to the population. And so what we end up with is a number of stagnant populations of bighorns. That's the typical bighorn population in Colorado. It gets to a certain size and it just doesn't grow beyond that. Even when there's abundant adequate habitat available, they just don't get there. And they don't get there because of this disease. The only management that we know of right now that's effective, there is no treatment for the disease. There's not a vaccine. There's not a way to really treat the animals once they're sick. The separation of domestics and bighorns. And bighorns are notorious for doing what we call forays, which are their walkabouts. And especially young males will just get up, leave their herd and go wandering off for a while, and commonly return back to the herd they came from. But if they're in this situation and making contact with domestic sheep, and those domestic sheep are infected with M. ovi, then it's very likely that the bighorn will become infected and can take that disease back to its native herd or its home herd. And CPW has killed bighorn sheep that have moved out of their native herd or their natal herd and gone and had contact with domestic sheep because they know that the threat is real. And so this is our biggest problem with bighorns. I don't know how we got there. Well, so grazing management is the one thing that we know of that we can do to effectively manage this disease and manage the way they interact, domestics interact with bighorns. Separation is the only thing we have. And one of the things, the way that's been accomplished is buyouts of allotments. Now, I think Randy Gormley's on the call, and so he knows the Forest Service system better than I do and how allotments work. But basically, a rancher has a right to use a particular part of the forest. And what has gone on in the buyout situation is that organizations like, particularly in the case locally, like the National Wildlife Federation, have made a payment directly to the rancher. That rancher has then abandoned that allotment, and the Forest Service has agreed, at least in principle, to not restock that allotment with another rancher's herd anytime in the future. So that's a technique that's been used. It's one that's pretty effective. It's a win-win in a certain sense. I mean, the rancher is getting a substantial financial benefit out of it, and we're getting the removal of a disease transmission mechanism to bighorns. The one was completed last year in the Weminuche. This is one of J. Paul Brown's allotments, the Endlick Mesa allotment, which he has now vacated, and which, you know, our expectation is will never be restocked with domestic sheep. It may be restocked with cattle. That's a possibility, but cattle are not a problem as far as this disease transmission occurs. The other thing that needs to be done is to empower CPW to take a stronger stance on bighorn management and the interactions with bighorn sheep. As I mentioned, they know that this is the biggest issue they have with bighorn sheep populations, but there was a memorandum of understanding signed between CPW, the Colorado wool growers, BLM, Forest Service, the Department of Agriculture, State Department of Agriculture. And one of the things that MOU did, it had a statement in it that CPW would not recommend the closure of a domestic sheep allotment solely on the basis of the potential for disease transmission to bighorn sheep. And that just basically, they can't do their job if they're under those circumstances, under that stricture. And that MOU has expired, but CPW still, for the most part, acts as if it's still in place. And they have not taken a strong stance. They need to be given the political authority, I guess, to do it, or the will. And you know, the agricultural industry in Colorado is strong, and it's difficult to stand up to the industry. But this is a case where CPW is unable to do its job because of the way the agricultural industry has a hold on the agency. That's what I had, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I will say thank you, and don't forget to donate at sanjuancitizens.org. Can't do our work without you. So at this point, I'd be happy to entertain any questions you might have.
Hey, Gary, Dave Wagner here. I got a question for you about the wolf reintroduction. When I was on the Living with Wildlife board for the county, the biggest protagonists of harvesting wildlife were the Department of Agriculture Wildlife Services. How do you propose, or have you had any discussions with them, or will they be part of the collaborative process, or will they always be under the thumb of J. Paul Brown and others who want to just harvest any predators?
Well, you really asked like 3 questions there, Dave. But
sorry, buddy.
The short answer is Wildlife Services will be involved in the process. They'll be part of the, they are part of the technical working group. So they'll have direct input to the plan development there. And in other states, CPW just had an education session last night that they did a virtual meeting, and it was folks from Montana, and George Edwards is the director of Montana's Livestock Loss Board, which deals with losses of livestock to predators. And the way, you know, he described Wildlife Services and how they work with it, and it actually seems to be pretty functional. I mean, Wildlife Services does what it does very well. They're very good at confirming the losses of livestock to wildlife and determining what species caused it and when it caused it. So they really are good at it. And they're also good at killing wildlife when that seems to be the desired result of some sort of depredation. But they will be involved. How that program's going to develop, I don't know. And I know that it's going to be one of the most contentious issues that we deal with in the planning process, as far as how to put together a compensation program that feels adequate to the livestock community, but also feels like it's not a giveaway to the remainder of the citizens of Colorado. That's where the balance is going to be, and I'm sure that people will be unhappy on both sides of it. But to answer your basic question, yes, they will be deeply involved in the process.
Great. Thank you.
You bet. Surely someone else has a question. Well, I guess no one does. Oh, Buzz does.
Gary, does the situation in Wyoming include Yellowstone and environs in terms of the wolf being shootable, harvestable? Does that include Yellowstone, or is that a separate?
It does not, Buzz. There is an area around Yellowstone. So Yellowstone, of course, is a national park and managed differently, and there is no hunting within Yellowstone at all. Outside of the park, there is a sort of a buffer area that is called the trophy area within Wyoming. And that area, they do issue limited hunting licenses. So wolves can be harvested there, but a limited number of them. Outside that, in about 80% of Wyoming, is where it's the wolf is currently classified as a predator, and that's where you can kill it any way you want, anytime you want. So that's the situation there. So there is a limited area, but wolves dispersing from northwest Wyoming have a rough go of it to try to get to Colorado.
Yeah. Thank you.
You bet.
Gary, this is.
Hi, Randy.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I'm still not real great on the Zoom thing here. But first of all, very good to see you, and great presentation. Good overview. Really enjoyed it. I did send in a couple questions, got in late. I was really up very early doing one of those breeding bird survey routes and got in late. So I'm a little loony right now, but I tried to send in some questions in the last half hour there. I don't know if you got them, but one of them was, I can't recall if the 2004 working group recommendations for wolves in Colorado set a goal for number of pairs or individuals, and if so, how do you foresee that working into the 2023 plan, and is that just going to be a whole new effort, really, with that in mind?
That group did not address numbers, and of course, that group wasn't even didn't even address the issue of reintroduction. At that point, the focus was on the potential for wolves to come in from mostly from the north, potentially from the south, but certainly from the north, and how we would manage them if they arrived, if we started to have wolves. And the key, one of the key findings of the group was that if wolves are in Colorado and they're not causing any problems, we'll leave them alone. And that, I think, is I know that certainly on the stakeholder group, that is going to be one of my main points, is that there's really no basis for a numerical goal for wolf populations that I can see. Wolves manage their own population numbers. If they're causing problems, you deal with the problems. If they're not, you leave them alone. And if there are 100 wolves and no problems, that's good. If there are 1,000 wolves and no problems, that's good. But if you start to have problems, you deal with the problems. So that, I don't think a numerical goal can be established. I don't even know what basis you'd establish it on. I mean, how would you determine a numerical goal for wolves? I don't know. I mean, I don't think there's a logical, biologically sound way to do that. There are social ways to do it. People can say, I don't want more than 10 wolves in my county, and again, has no biological basis, but I don't see any way of establishing a numerical goal from a biological standpoint.
Okay, yeah, I was just curious about that. And do you foresee, just one other thing, and then I'll get off. I think it's going to be important somehow to I don't know how this gets solidified with things that are happening in some of the states right now. When you have a change in administration, should you set some kind of goals or range or something like that? And that might be important for when you have this kind of change in administrations and philosophies and such, that we don't have this turnaround coming back to things like they're going on in Idaho or stuff, where it seems like they're really taking the opposite approach to really try to reduce them as much as they possibly can without exterminating them. So that's going to be an important feature, I think.
Right. Yeah. And yeah, I do feel that Colorado is socially different than those states, at least enough really different, that we'll be able to stave some of that off. Because, it was their legislatures that went that way. And yeah, their state wildlife agency was opposed to what the legislature did. They basically told the agency, the biologists who understand population management, they told them to go pound sand. And that's what happened. And so
Yeah.
I don't think we'll see that in Colorado. I mean, of course, we could have a major shift in philosophy over time, and then that could happen. And recognize that Proposition 114 changed statutory law. It's not in the Constitution, it's a statute, and the legislature can change statutes anytime they want. So if there's anything that comes along that, indicates that wolves, then, essentially what happened in those northern states is the legislature feels like there shouldn't be as many wolves as there are, but they could do it. They could find some way to change it. And they could change the, things like the deadline that we have for completing the wolf management plan. So there are any of the number of things they could do, since it is only a statute. Right now, we're hopeful that as long as Governor Polis is in place, that won't change, that he'll try to maintain the wolf reintroduction program at the level he can. And of course, we have an election coming up in 2022 for the governor, so things could change there. But hopefully we just won't have the same kind of philosophy in Colorado that we've seen in Montana, well, all three states, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that answer.
Yeah, thank you, Randy. Anyone else have any thoughts or questions? Or, if you have things that do come to mind, always feel free to contact me. Randy, I don't know if you sent your questions in via email, but I wasn't monitoring that. So that's, if I missed them, that's why. If anybody does have any questions for me about any of this or any other wildlife issues, that you think I might be able to help you with, please feel free to just get in touch with me through the Alliance, and I'll be happy to do what I can for you.
And Gary's also going to have a wolf booth at the farmers market on Saturday, the 26th as well. So if you wanted some one-on-one discussion there, please stop by and say hi. That's, I think it's from 8 o'clock to noon.
Yes. Thanks for that, Susan.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate it. And again, feel free to reach out if there's any way I can help you on things.
Thank you, Gary. Nice job.
Thank you.
Good job.
All right. He does a good job, doesn't he?
Yeah.